Okay, so welcome to CrossFit Fort Worth, my home gym, and also the 40 Fit Nation. My name is Darren Deaton. I'm a PT and CrossFit coach. This is Corey Dole. He's a 42-year-old athlete that trains with us here at the gym. Today we're going to talk about shoulder mobility assessment, not necessarily diagnosis, but assessment. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to take Corey through a quick exercise that you can do with your coach or a fellow athlete to try to assess how your shoulder mobility is. From looking at the 40 Fit Nation Facebook page and all the comments and the requests, it looks like the shoulder seems to be the joint that the older athlete has the most amount of trouble with. I'll agree with that. I think Corey will agree with that some too. And so that's why we're isolating this joint today. Now, as we talked about before, when we do joint mobility, when we do dynamic and static mobility, we want to be doing our dynamic mobility in our warm-up before the workout. We want to be getting a good sweat on, get this connective tissue, get these muscles loose and pliable and ready for work to handle loads too. And then we want to be doing mostly our static mobility work, static flexibility work after the training session or after the WOD. Now, there are some occasions where we're going to do some static flexibility beforehand, before the work, and that's when we're doing strength work, ollie lifts or weightlifting, where we need to achieve certain positions, and it's important for us to get those muscles and those tendons and ligaments and joint capsules pliable for that position. A good example would be the front squat and the front squat rack position. We might stretch the lats and the shoulders and the horizontal abductors or the muscles that do this prior to the exercise session or the lifting session, just to get us in the right biomechanical position for lifting. Otherwise, we're going to focus on our mobility and flexibility afterwards, our dynamic warm-up beforehand. So today what we're going to do is we're going to help you and your coach, or you and your fellow athlete, assess your shoulders. That's the key here. We want to keep it simple. The shoulder is a 3D axial joint. It'll go just about any direction. It makes it a complicated joint to assess, to treat, and to also train sometimes. So we want to keep it simple and focus on basically 2 or 3 different areas today. First area we're going to focus on is the latissimus dorsi, the muscle that could limit overhead elevation or flexion and keep you from getting in the upright pressing shoulder press position to be able to load that weight correctly through the hand, elbow, and the shoulder directly overhead. So the lat is going to be in this area right here. The latissimus comes up and attaches in the front of the humerus. So you can see if the muscle's coming up and attaching here, and if I'm tight, when Corey goes to raise his arm up overhead, I'm going to pull his arm down, not allowing his arm to go into full elevation. So let's look at what our normal needs to look like. Let's turn him sideways. And we're going to have him raise this arm all the way up overhead into full elevation. So what we want to be seeing here is we want to see the arm close to the ear, okay, which he has a little bit of tightness getting there. It tells me the lat is tight already. And we want to see this angle at 180 degrees or straight, like a straight pillar, okay? We want everything in good collection. We want the scapular musculature to be contracted and pulling down and back. We want his upper tract to be contracted. And as you can see, we've got a little bit of loss in elevation here that we're going to address today. All right, bring your arms down. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take him through what we call a multi-segmental selective functional movement analysis. Fancy group of words for we're going to see if his body can bend where it needs to go. So what we're looking for in this movement is we're going to have him arch back with his arms overhead, and we're looking for the hand to be behind the heels, for the hip, the front of the hip bones, the ASIS bone, to be in front of the toes, and for him to have a nice lumbar curve, and for the shoulder to be fully elevated and open at the shoulder joint. So let's do that. So feet about shoulder width apart. Okay, and he's going to reach overhead, and he's going to arch back. So we already did this earlier this morning, and what we found was Corey's issue is probably also in the lumbar spine. So here we see the shoulders are not quite fully elevated, but his arms are way back. He's having to bend his knees to get there, and when we don't allow him to bend his knees, then we see that his hip bone is not quite in front of his toes. So we bring him back up. So on Corey, what we found out doing this earlier this morning is one of his problem areas is the lat, but the greatest area of needed, I guess you would say, intervention is this low back area right in here where he has a loss of lumbar extension. And so we would work on that with Corey, and we can do that in another video session later on. We're going to focus on the shoulder joint today though. So now we look at Corey and we say, okay, Corey's got a loss of shoulder elevation. So let's assess why. So we're going to be looking at the latissimus dorsi, the pec musculature, both the pec major and minor, and then the shoulder capsule area. There are some other areas that we can focus on here we're not going to address today, and that is the thoracic spine, the cervical spine, and the lumbar spine. We'll address those areas in those sessions. So we're going to have Corey lay on the floor, and this is something your coach or your fellow athlete could do with you. And what we're looking for with Corey here is that when he goes into a recumbent position, we're going to have him raise his arms all the way over his head in just a minute. When he does that, our goal for normal movement would be the back nice and flat, and for him to get his arms flush and flat and touching the ground. If he can't do that, then we've got to assess why he can't. So we're going to assume that Corey can't, and we're going to have him raise his arms overhead. And he goes into position, and we can't get the arms all the way to the ground, okay? Now we might make the assumption that it's his lat that's keeping him from doing it, but it may not be his lat. So let's assess that. We're going to have him bring his arms back down. We're going to have him bring his knees up to his chest, bring them all the way up, and already we saw in this that we saw a reduction in rotation and range of motion in his lumbar spine. Just the way he moved told me that. So now we bring his legs up, and we have him bring his arms back down, and his arms actually should be a little higher off the ground, okay? Bring them up a little bit, while he even has less mobility there. Now the reason why he would have less mobility here if the lat was tight would be because I've tightened up the fascia in the low back and the attachment point for the lat. So I've stretched the lat and kept its anchoring point from moving. That means he's going to lose flexibility in that shoulder if it's his lat that's the problem. Now I'm going to lower his legs down, and as he lowers the legs down, I'm going to look and see what happens to the arms. If the arms come back down and he doesn't arch too much in here, we try to keep him flat in here, then that tells me that it's the lat that's limiting part of that rotation or that full elevation of that shoulder joint. Then we can focus on the lat and stretching. So that's a quick little selective functional mobility assessment technique that you can do to look at lat tightness. Now the other thing I want to look at with Corey is basically his pecs. Two pecs, the pec minor, which angles here, and the pec major, which is more of a horizontal angle. So one thing I'm going to have him do is bring his arm up overhead, and I'm going to have him go into 45 degrees of upward elevation, just like that. If he can't get there, and he can't bring his arm behind his ear without overextending the back or overextending the scapular area here, or trying to arch like this, then we can tell that there might be some pec minor tightness here that we need to address. Bringing the arm back down, we're going to look at the pec major. We're going to bring his arm into a 90-90 position, just like this. And we're looking for the same thing here, for him to be able to get the hand behind the head and ear, the forearm behind the head and ear, and for the shoulder to open up. And he ought to be able to actively do that without me helping. If it takes my force to overpressure him and get there, then that tells us that he's tight. That means these scapular posterior chain musculature are going to have to overwork when he gets into lifting positions. So on him, it looks like the pecs look pretty good, not too tight. We do have some lat tightness we want to address. We can also address just general shoulder capsular mobility on him, which are the ligaments of the joint. Now with the older athlete, what I see is that the connective tissue, the muscles, sometimes have gotten tighter with age. But also, because of us sitting in front of a desk or a computer and being rounded and posturally like this, we start to get tightness in the front of our capsule, looseness in the back of our capsule, and we get this unstable humeral head in the glenoid. So we get this shoulder joint that's just not starting in the right position. Now, we can assess that capsule very simply by having him do what we call some scratch and reach test. We're just looking at mobility of that shoulder generally. Now, shoulder capsule limitations will generally feel deep and kind of more of a boring, less muscular type feel in regards to stretching. It's going to feel deep, and it almost feels like you just hit a block. With a lot of older athletes, they just can't get the shoulder capsule to open up anymore from years of bad postural positioning at work or whatever else they do. So we're going to have Corey turn around, and we're going to have him basically reach and try to touch the center of his back. So we bring the arm up, touch the center. We ought to be able to see good opening and full elevation. We don't see that here, so we know with him that it's mostly due to his lat tightness because we've tested his lat. Bring the arm back down, and now we're going to have him do it with the other arm. He should all be able to reach at least the center of his back, and he has more limitation on the left than he does on the right. Now we're going to have him do behind the back reach here. Should be able to get the hand flat and in the middle of the low back, and we're going to have him do the other one. Alright, so he's got pretty good mobility there, alright? So, for Corey, our prescription for intervention is basically this. We're going to work on his lat tightness, and then for him also as an athlete, we're going to start working on his lumbar range of motion into extension because we saw that in his movement analysis. So, these are just some easy things that you can start to do for assessment of that shoulder joint. We want to be looking for lat tightness, pec tightness, and shoulder joint capsule mobility, range of motion issues. Now remember, if any of this stuff is painful, then that might lead us to another direction. You could have a shoulder issue, a cartilage issue, a rotator cuff issue. We're not addressing that. We're addressing basically just general mobility loss here. None of this stuff should be painful. It might be sore and you might feel stretching sensation but not pain. So we want either dysfunctional or functional movement with no pain. So that's the end of our session today, and we'll be doing another video here soon to show you how to stretch out this shoulder joint, and we'll probably have Corey as our beautiful model again to work on this shoulder mobility and improve that lat stretching and improve that low back. So have a great day, and thanks for being part of the 40 Fit Nation.